Hello, I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers50. Welcome to the Thinkers50 Ideas Premiere. We're delighted that you have joined us. The Ideas Premiere is a taster of what's to come on November 15th and 16th at the Thinkers50 Awards Gala 2021, when, as well as the stellar lineup of speakers, the winners of the Thinkers50 Distinguished Achievement Awards and the all-new Thinkers50 ranking will be announced. For those who are joining one of these events for the first time, some background. The Thinkers50 is the world's most reliable resource for identifying, ranking and sharing the best management and business ideas of our age, ideas that can make a real difference in the world. There's nothing so practical as a great idea, is something we've always believed. If you're attending the Ideas Premiere by special invitation and want to participate in the gala, you can secure your premium tickets at thinkers50.com, where you can also see the exciting program. We really hope you can join us. Before we start, I'd like to thank our partners and especially the Business Ecosystem Alliance for their support of this session. We are especially delighted that our host today is one of the preeminent thinkers in the area of business ecosystems, Michael Jacobidis. Michael is a professor at London Business School and a Thinkers50 ranked thinker. He is also in Athens, where there is a horrific storm at the moment. So hopefully the line will survive for the hour. So I will allow Michael to take the virtual stage and to tell us more about our two great guests today, Cristina Caffarra and Monica Dernay. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and it's great to be here. Also, let me note with appreciation the context, not only for the ranking, but also, and importantly, for debate and the promotion of management thinking that has come from Thinkers50. And I think that this is an important time to understand how business is changing, not only because it's useful for business in order to be more successful, in order to compete better, and in order to be able to grow, but also for society at large. This is a really interesting and unusual time, especially in the world of ecosystems. As the traditional industry boundaries crumble, as we see the previous divisions that existed both for regulatory reasons and for technological reasons, well, we could see one sector clearly delineated from the other. Life was fairly simple. Now these are going down. Now that leads to not only opportunities, but challenges. Opportunities and challenges for corporates, because of course, firms can no longer be content that they know what they do. An automobile company can't just produce automobiles today. It needs to do more, and we'll be looking at this terrific case study in greater detail. But it also leads to opportunities and challenges for society. Why? Well, because as we have seen, there are some firms that say, hey, if this is again a form of primordial soup, if what we have seen with this dissolution of industry boundaries and the changes in the previously held restrictions on how we compete, we can reorganize and repackage things. We want to do that, and we want to benefit from it. And we have seen a few firms, the big tech, they're called big tech, they're a little more than just technology firms, perhaps we'll touch on it as well, that are reorganizing, and as now they are expanding and going to ever more verticals, increasing their scope, increasing their multi-ecosystem activities, and changing how ecosystems will look like. That then gives us this terrific set of questions of what next in ecosystems, what next for competition in terms of what firms do, but what next of competition for society, for customers, for dominance, for the way that the world will look like. So in order to think about these questions, I'm privileged and thrilled that we're joined by two complementary presenters. We're joined by Cristina Caffarra, who will have to speak to an antitrust conference, so she'll leave just before we end our session. And Cristina is helps drive the European antitrust policy for Charles River's Associates CRA, and has been involved in a number of the antitrust cases for some and against some of the big tech. And we're also joined by Monica Dernay, who leads the mobility ecosystems and data ecosystems for BMW, which is a player that has adjusted and is in the process of trying to adjust in this interesting transition that we are seeing from companies that may be focused on doing one thing and doing it real well. I'm biased, I've got 2 of their cars, and also to something which is much broader, that is able to offer services and that needs to interact with these big technology firms. We will be looking at the mobility and automobile sector that showcases this migration from these traditional boundaries to these new areas, that showcases this effort of the big technology companies to enter and change the playing field, and which raises these issues of both competition, which is how do we succeed, and competition in terms of competitiveness. So thanks a lot again for being with us, Cristina and Monica, and I look forward to learning from you. Now, if I may start by asking Monica, since I think that the mobility case is a fascinating one, but not all of our listeners will really know what this is about. Can you help us by understanding, by explaining to us how these ecosystems have changed? How is it that the car is not just a car, but it connects with various ecosystems, and we should perhaps focus it, because it connects with so many, to the mobility and the underlying data issues. So stage is yours to give us a sense, and then we'll move to Cristina in terms of the dynamics between different types of firms.
Well, thank you, Michael, for the introduction, and thank you also for the invitation. I think this topic is a real important one going forward, especially for our industry. As you noted, we've been making cars for 100 years, and it basically used to be like a hardware business. You make one car for the whole world and you can sell it anywhere. And then digitalization started to crop up, and that became a bit more difficult because people expected their devices to interact with the car. This has been changing gradually. We have more and more things being digitalized that the car is expected to interact with. You have the customers that have a mobile phone. The car needs to interact with that mobile phone. You have urban ecosystems that the car needs to interact with, parking machines, all the devices in the city, and up to autonomous driving in the end, where the car really needs to be steered even by the ecosystem. And I think this is growing to be a huge challenge for us, because you have older cars, you have newer cars, you need to make sure that these all are enabled to interact with the ecosystems. The customers expect seamless interaction. So the car needs to be able to switch from one ecosystem to the other really quick. And there are huge challenges that we are currently facing, apart from the issues that you also raised, which we are going to talk about later a bit, I think, of other people who also have ecosystems trying to go into these fields as well, and maybe coming at it from another angle like Google or Apple, and that we have to compete with as a car manufacturer if we want to still succeed in the business.
Okay, so let me have a follow-on question on what you just said here, Monica, because, you know, a skeptic would say, okay, all right, it may be more work for you guys, but it's great for everyone else. Because in the past, all you needed to do is that you do your car. And what you're telling me now is, guess what? As digital technology proceeds, very important issue. And I'm saying that because I think that we see it in mobility, we will increasingly see it in other areas, from healthcare to all security to all manner of things. So coming close to you in a sector that has not been changed soon. But what we see is that digital technology means that happiness does not come one product at a time. It is a product that needs to interact with other things that you do, or that needs to interact with infrastructure. I could say, okay, all right, I get it. But why is this a problem? Perhaps you guys in BMW need to simply do more homework, and you need to think not only about your product, but you need to think about how your product connects. But what's the big deal? Isn't that just a great thing for all consumers? What's your take on that?
Yes, I agree. It's a great thing for the consumer. I completely agree, but with one caveat: if it works. So if it works, it's a great thing, and we are doing our utmost to make it work. But sometimes it's not in our power to make things work. There are a lot of unsolved questions in terms of data ecosystems. Who does the data belong to? Where do we store it? How can we share data with our competitors? Because we used to have everything separate. So do we have to give all our data to other car manufacturers? Is there a platform that takes care of the data? For example, with autonomous driving, if something happens to the data or happens to the car, whose fault is it? So there are a lot of unsolved legal questions. And also the digital world changes fairly quickly. So this is the issue of keeping up with all the technology that's coming, that's adding to the ecosystem. And I think what customers don't like is if things don't work. So if you have the one phone that does not interact with the car, you have to look for the car that your phone interacts with. This is probably not in your interest as well. So I think the fact that the digitalization and the ecosystem topic demands more interaction by all players, I think is a challenge for the overall industry, not just for us at BMW.
Okay, so let me just go, because I wanted to ask Cristina now a question. Let me just go and do a bit of sense making. I'll also connect it to theory, since Stuart was speaking about theory. One of the things that I hear you say is essentially that ecosystems must work, that there is a promise, but you need to make them work. And one of the risks is that they don't. Ironically, if you think about it theoretically, we're seeing market failures that are addressed by ecosystems. But ecosystems themselves may have failures. So rather than only thinking about, hey, we can't make all this information interconnect, there is also a risk that we make it interconnect, but as we make it interconnect, we create a very uneven and unfair world that is driven by only a few firms that may have side effects. So Cristina, you spend your time thinking about what is a fair and unfair world. Can you give us a sense of what your concerns may be with these new requirements that we have in the way that society works?
Thank you, Michael. And it's a pleasure to be here. Just something I always do, by the way of disclosure, you mentioned that I work for a number of entities. I worked adverse to Google. I've never done any work for or against Facebook. I've done work for governments. I worked for Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Uber, and some more. That is the disclosure. I want to pick up on a number of things that Monica said, because as you mentioned, the mobility ecosystem is a great case study. It's a great case study of the kind of concerns that have been playing out in the antitrust and regulatory world, and that we're still grappling with. I think it's a great illustration of a kind of a fundamental concern that we have with many of these digital giants. The notion that they are so pervasive and large, and they acquire so many data, they control a significant ecosystem that allows them to extend and leverage and cascade their position from a market to the next. Remember that when all of us kind of confronted this digital world, perhaps as recently as even 10 years ago, the vision that we had was that the digital world was going to be characterized by diversity, variety, multi-homing. We were going to be able to seamlessly move from one provider to another. What has actually happened is that gradually and quickly, these more diverse universes have actually collapsed into 3-4 attention brokers, which funnel our attention. And these have become incredibly dominant in their own expanding ecosystem. And the concern is that that power that they have accumulated largely as a result of a presence and a data advantage is being expanded and extended into other places. And the mobility ecosystem is just one very good example in which you have providers like Google of an entire set of apps which are on people's devices and are able to offer OEMs a deal for installing those apps into the cars. What are the implications of that? Well, it is convenient from one point of view for the consumers who can go into the car and then synchronize their apps, their app store, their ecosystem with the car. But on the other hand, how much space does that leave for competition for suppliers of individual apps that would like to get into the car and be integrated in the ecosystem, but are not? So there is a live question which is being considered right now by regulators precisely around that. Is there is, in my view, in this space, a concern over leveraging market power in exchange for data, because what these providers do is to say, you can have my in-car entertainment, it won't cost you much, but I want the data, as Monica alluded to. And so this is a significant example. Briefly, where is the regulation antitrust world in all of this? Well, the reality, and you heard me saying this before, Michael, is that antitrust has failed dramatically in this space so far. I mean, and it is the case that while antitrust enforcement has been well-meaning, we have achieved precisely zero in the last 10 years in terms of outcomes. There have been cases against Google, something against Facebook. There's something in the air, there's something there, but nothing kind of delivers. And so this is why we are facing a great big pivot towards ex-ante regulation, which I'm sure we will expand on in a minute. The big question is, where is that going? And is it likely to be more effective in ultimately taming and shaping the world we are going to?
So if I summarize that a little bit crudely, you're saying, yes, there are terrific opportunities that ecosystems offer, and you agree with Monica that this needs a lot of being able to align different parties in order to bring up the latent possibilities that digital technology opens, for which ecosystems are particularly well suited, because you need sets of collaborating firms that have products and services that commingle, that can produce stuff of final value to the customer. But at the same time, you say that there is an issue because the people that are doing this coordination is a very small number of firms that, if anything, are continuing to not only cement, but also expand their dominance. So
they don't want the interoperability that Monica alluded to.
Yeah. Maybe can I add one other aspect that's also important in this regard? I think there's also a certain regional aspect to this, because where are the big players coming from? And the regulation in these areas are very much different. So we have the American players like Google and Apple. You have the European players there where the market is not.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Regulation is super fun. I will want to go a little later on that, because you know, for sure, for those of us who have been involved in the discussions of regulation, these things are sort of self-evident. But let me again broaden it up for the people who might not be quite as familiar with these problems that we see here. So, Cristina, let me play devil's advocate. You know that I agree with you, but we still need to figure out what the problem here is. And someone could say, okay, all right, so the big problem that you're speaking about is that ecosystems are great. They deliver products of value. They deliver integrated experiences. They require many firms to coordinate. Perhaps a few firms are doing it, but why isn't it, as many of the people who are funded by big tech would say, competition on merit? Which means that it is better firms who have simply been able to deliver stuff of value to the customers. So we shouldn't be concerned about the fact that the market capitalization that they have has shot through the roof, and after COVID has doubled almost, because they're doing their job right and capital goes to them, and we should all be chill about it. Why are you not chill about it?
Well, I mean, I'm not concerned about size per se or market capitalization per se. Some are, and there is a view in antitrust, particularly in the current administration in the US, that size per se is problematic, because you need to worry about also the dispersion of economic power if you want to somewhat control the dispersion of political power. That's not what we think about in Europe. We don't think about bigness as a problem per se. We think about conduct. And what is true is that no one is, I think, objecting in Europe to the sheer size of this operation. It is the conduct which is problematic. It is the ability to essentially extract and exploit data in ways that are that remain opaque, that allow you to effectively push that monopoly into new markets. It is the fact that you can exclude others. It is the fact that you can exploit others. It is really that set of conducts that is at issue here. It isn't just because they're big and successful. The concern is that what they do has connotations that are ultimately going to frustrate entry, contestability, and innovation. Why are we in a world in which every single innovator in Silicon Valley is thinking about doing an app that he can sell to Apple or Amazon or Google? Why every single innovator in Silicon Valley thinks about users to be monetized, data to be collected, subscriptions to be sold, and advertisers? Because that is the predominant model that now prevails, because no one is doing innovation in other directions. So startups are all doing that, and then they're going to be sucked up by the giants. But is that the kind of diverse and creative innovation we want to see? That's what worries me. It is the elimination of opportunities for competition and the narrowing down of innovation into a lane that is the one that absolutely suits just the giants. There's no one else.
Terrific. So basically, and again, to put it in context, what we're saying is that the world is changing, competition is moving towards ecosystems, there's great opportunities, but even the people who capitalize on these opportunities make a few strong firms stronger. And the underlying economics and the power structures that we have are such that we can't really police it. And one of the reasons that Cristina is alluding to is that we kind of had a toolkit for dealing with that, and that was regulation and antitrust. But the playbook that we have was not written for the ecosystem age. It was written for a previous age where you had these very strict boundaries, which means that we have an interesting challenge as a society of what the heck do we do? The other thing that's been happening, and anyone reading the newspapers will know it, is that the mood has swung, that now big tech are considered to be evil, and people are concerned about it just because they see them be so big, which then means that we're going to have some competition, which then means that we're going to change the ecosystems. To what extent, how? Hold your horses. I'm going to be asking both of our guests in a moment. Before we do so, though, let me just go down a specific example, because I do see here for instance, Janka saying it's essential to have a shared understanding of what ecosystems are, and saying that in automotive ecosystem is used for a product and its surrounding services and parts. Now, let me just start by being a little bit more specific. So, Monica, can you help us understand when you speak about ecosystems in the mobility space? What are they? How do you guys in BMW think about ecosystems before we go back to the issues of competition?
Yes, I think the view that the ecosystem is around a product certainly used to be one that you had in a company, but I think you extend to today's ecosystem. If you look, for example, at mobility, it means the whole sphere that a customer is interacting with to be mobile. So you take away the product-centric view and you go to a customer-centric view. So what does a customer need to be mobile? If you look at the city, for example, you have individual mobility. That means I'm going by car. There's public transit. That means cars, buses, trams, etc. It may mean micromobility. It may mean long distance mobility. So there are a lot of systems that contribute to this ecosystem, and don't let me get started on the energy ecosystem that comes on top of it if you electrify everything. But all these different devices need to interact with each other, and potentially they are all being produced by different companies. So this ecosystem is a huge realm, a huge sphere of devices that are interacting with each other. And to add to a point that Cristina made before, and the point that you made, what does it do for the consumer? I mean, if it's interoperable, that is great for the consumer, because you have one ecosystem. You just need one operating system, for example. You can maybe access everything with one app, but you're also locked in to this ecosystem if you choose to be part of one certain ecosystem. So if you use an iPhone, you use all the Apple software. If you use a phone by Xiaomi, and you will select devices by Xiaomi because they all interact together. So I think that's also the point that Cristina was making. Once a big tech giant has developed an ecosystem that different devices interact with, that may also mean the customer is sort of stuck in this ecosystem and can't experience smaller players because then the devices don't work anymore.
Terrific. Monica, let me just emphasize that for a number of our listeners, the distinctions that you made, which essentially is the pushback to Janka's question, which is that in the olden days, a few months ago, in the olden days, we used to be thinking about ecosystems of the things that complement my product. But right now, this is a thinking that starts going to the past. You don't start by saying, hey, here's a product, I'm going to find things to put it together, but you're starting with the need of the customer and the bundle of things that the customer wants, because the customer is going to have the possibility of getting them in a number of different ways. And that gives rise to new opportunities to offer them services. And the way that you put these services together is defined by both how clever and efficient you are, and also whether you've got the breathing space in order to put them together. And that's where the competition issues come into play. So Cristina, although I want to return back to some more examples from mobility, Cristina, if I could go back to you, and if I can ask you, because I know that you've been involved, and you told us on which side you've been involved in the beginning of the recording, you've been involved in some of the recent discussions that are happening in what are the concerns with competition in the mobility case. Can you give us a concrete example of how it is that these new services that make life easier for the customer can also be connected to some firms abusing their dominant position and not allowing the other firms to come up? Because one of the things that we're looking in the future of ecosystems is creating a level playing field. And you're like, nah, let me tell you why. For instance, in the mobility space, it doesn't happen. Can you give us a concrete example so that people can understand?
Well, yes. And let me start by saying that the antitrust authorities, the agencies and the regulators don't think about ecosystems. This is not a concept that is known in our bubble. We think about markets, and markets are much narrower than an ecosystem. And then we think about what happens in the way in which the firm behaves in that market. What you can observe is that the firm is tying or bundling set the product together. So you can have this, but only if you have that. This was the famous Android case against Google, right? It was saying to the OEMs, you can have the Google Play Store, but only if you place search, my search engine, as the default at every point of engine on the phone. That is a form of tie, because you can have this if you have that. And that is known to be a driver for anti-competitive outcomes, because anyone who comes and offers an alternative is then not able to place an alternative search engine just simply because the OEM won't have it. Similar problems are arising precisely in automotive. If you are being offered a whole suite of apps that go into the car, an outside independent supplier of one of these apps finds it much more difficult to be, as I mentioned before, integrated. Tying, bundling, exclusivities, various other forms of advantages and extractive behavior is really what one translates all of this into. Ecosystems is not something that regulators kind of relate to direct. They need to see concretely conduct that is identifiable as being capable of foreclosing competition or exploiting rivals and consumers. So these are the kind of things that we have seen and we continue to see, right? And so this is how this kind of plays out in the competition space.
And let me translate that, Monica, onto some of the specifics. You guys need to interact with Google and Apple. What's wrong with that? What are your concerns in the way that BMW interacts with Google and Apple? You know, why don't you just do it and then move on with your life? What are the concerns that arise in the way that my BMW engages with these two firms?
Yes, definitely. And we do interact with Google and Apple. So if you buy a BMW, there's the opportunity you can get the, for example, the Apple CarPlay in the car. So there are definitely ways that we are interacting with them. But I think what is sort of worrying in a way is the, a car is a highly regulated good in terms of safety issues towards the consumer. And so we are bound by certain restrictions that we're looking at. And I think we have the question will be if Google and Apple are going further than wanting to just place their apps inside the car, but if they want to actually you provide the software that actually drives the car, and in essence, BMW would become a hardware delivering company. So
okay, so this is starting to make it perhaps clear to the people who are not as technically minded. One of the things that happens in these ecosystems is that the roles of the different players are being redefined. So what BMW wants to do is to be an intelligent player. It doesn't want to be dumb pipes. It doesn't only want to have the steel and the rubber and the leather and the fancy design. It wants to manage the experience that relates to the driver. So now let me turn that around, Monica, and let me ask you, fine, so what is it that you as a company is doing in order to drive customer-friendly ecosystems that are doing things that are valuable for yourselves? What is it that BMW has done in order to deliver this value to the customer, leaving aside the question about the competition with big tech?
Yeah, I think the customer wants to interact with these ecosystems. So you can't say, okay, I'm just doing my BMW app. There's no Google, there's no Apple inside the car, and you just have to deal with it. So the customer has a phone and he wants the car to interact with it. He wants to have access to certain services. So I think what we do make sure that there is an access to these ecosystems. But as I said, especially in terms of regulation, we need to make sure, for example, that there's no driver distraction inside of the vehicle. So we try to regulate what is going inside of the car. And especially in terms of data privacy, security, I think there are huge issues in terms of vehicles that move around. So what we are doing is to sort of have an extended vehicle backend, that's what we call it. So having basically a data bubble around the car that we allow certain services to access. So the customer can partake in the services without allowing the services complete access to the car. This will also become important when we think about autonomous driving. You don't want a third party actually getting access to your car and doing something to it when the customer wants to brake because there is an accident happening or something. So we say that we still need to have access to the car, but we need to provide access to the customer as well.
So this is what you're saying and how you want to relate to the other players. But let me be even more concrete. When you say that we are offering now, we are becoming a part of an ecosystem.
Yes.
What does that mean? Just tell me from the consumer vantage point. Okay, so BMW is an ecosystem. What the heck does that mean for me? It asks all these things about data, but how has that changed my experience?
There are a number of things. First of all, obviously the entertainment sector, but let me give you a concrete example. We had in the urban mobility sector where we interact with the urban ecosystem. If you have a plug-in hybrid, that obviously it is electric and it has a combustion engine, and you drive into the city. Cities didn't like it because there was a combustion happening in the city, and they wanted it to be noiseless and less pollution. So what we did is install an app that interacts with the city ecosystem so that if you drive over a certain area, the engine switches to electric. That means you are using your electric drive in the city, and you still can use your combustion engine outside of the city. So the customer gets the benefit of actually using the electric power, and the city gets the benefit of having the electric engine in the city. So these are some examples of how the interaction between the car and the ecosystem happens for the customer. But that means we need to talk to the city and we need to get these ecosystems in place.
Okay, and that takes us to another very important thing, which is that as the world is facing more systemic challenges, using a product isn't just my own prerogative. How I use it, whether I drive it electric, whether I drive it hybrid, and what the vehicle does, whether it's noisy or not, is something that society says, I'm going to have a particular view on that. So when we're speaking about creating ecosystem value, it is not just because it adds value to the customer, but it is that because it is able to gain acceptance from society because it does more stuff. So again, you don't just sell something to the customer, you sell something that is important for society at large. And you're like, I'm going to be able to do that, and I will find new ways of doing it. But that has to do with the ecosystem I shift from a product to a bundle. And this bundle may be relevant either for the customer who manages the mobility, or for the city that consumes the mobility or sees the impact of mobility and too much pollution or too much noise or too much traffic. Let me now ask you about the different dimension of ecosystems, because ecosystems, plug to a forthcoming California Management Review, ecosystems have two different dimensions. One of them is that ecosystems are these bundles of products and services, what we'd call the multi-product or the experience ecosystems that we provide. The second thing is the multi-actor, i.e. that in order to make that work, you also need to collaborate with many other firms, which means that rather than thinking that you can organize it all yourself from your own engineers, with your own people, or from your own suppliers, you're like, I now need to go and engage with people outside, not only to produce, but also to come up with new ideas, because I'm not the smartest kid in the universe. And I know that there are others with good ideas that live outside and are not within my own remit. So if you're going to look at this kind of stuff, and if you're like, okay, what has BMW done to move beyond its own remit and start engaging with other organizations, either to collaborate and co-create value, or to bring them in for new ideas? What are the changes? How can we see BMW create such innovation through its own ecosystems? And then after that, we'll move back to Cristina and the power of the big guys.
I think there was also a question in the chat that alluded to that. Are CEOs actually aware of ecosystems? And I think it has been a learning journey also for BMW, especially if you're in an engineer-driven firm and you're used to doing things yourself. I think the notion of having to cooperate is some that had to grow. But I think at BMW, we always have had a lot of focus on innovation. So innovation is important for us, and I think we have a rather large focus on cooperating with other companies. I mean, we've already cooperated with OEMs, for example, Toyota and so forth. But I think increasingly we are cooperating with new technology and smaller startups as well. To get an idea of what is happening in the fast-moving digital world. I mean, we do have cooperation with Google and Amazon and so forth, but I think especially cooperating with smaller companies gives you these ideas of how things are moving. So we have like a startup incubator, we have an investment business that invests in startups, and we have a search process where we also send our engineers to talk to startups to get a feeling of the mindset of these startups, and to get a feeling of the world out there where different companies have to interact. So I think that's a big change in the mindset of developing products as well.
So as we are moving to these broader experiential multi-product bundles that also need to interact with different buyers or authorities, you are also bringing in more people who can facilitate this transition or even bring up new innovation. We may want to return back to how BMW does that in particular, but before we do so, Cristina, I think that this takes us to this broader question of collaboration between different firms. And right now, if you ask the big firms, and you speak with them, I speak with them, they will tell you, oh, all these people are unfair. We are helping so many collaborations. We are supporting all this joint value creation. But you seem to have an idea that we must find a better, more level playing field for these collaborations. And you also have some thoughts about which way we will do it. Now, before we move to whether antitrust alone can do it or whether we should use other tools and hold that thought, give us first a sense of what you think the problem is. Why is it that in this world, you may have an issue in terms of how you collaborate?
I want to go back to some of the points also Monica made. I mean, let's take a step back. The issue here is that there are business models that are essentially relying on data monetization. This is a major issue. And what we see is that the conduct of some of these businesses are driven by various ways in which data can be monetized. The kind of examples I gave before, the Android example, the in-car entertainment, are ways in which an established player can say, I will give you this bundle of services in exchange for you essentially providing the data, because that's what I end up monetizing. So really, we're talking about a world in which we need to understand and deal with the implications of all of this. One of the things we should be doing is certainly much more wall-to-wall interoperability, as I see it, because it is only interoperability that can remove some of these proprietary walled garden barriers. Many of the standards that are effectively applied by some of these firms are their own. And therefore, if you want to build on their activity, you need to conform. And this was the example of the innovation I've given before. You need to essentially be an app that effectively interfaces with this. But in terms of providing an incentive to compete and be effective, you need to make sure that the barriers to entry are lessened, that the network effects are not limited to a single firm. And so interoperability is recognized as being a major tool that in principle we could actually use to get us forward. Except that when you go and talk to people about interoperability, it's, oh, no, this is all terrible. We don't want to do it. Why? Because it stands a chance of eroding that market power. And of course, the excuse that is typically used is, but here we have privacy regulation that allow us to do very, very little. We have customer data, we need to be very certain. This is where privacy regulation, which is in my view an incredibly important tool of the present and the future, is misused entirely, right? Because the big giants are misusing a lot of the GDPR kind of stuff to say we can't interoperate. That involves a lot of problems with that. That needs to be resolved. Interoperability is something that absolutely needs to be mandated in a very serious, significant way, which means also you need to establish protocols, you need to establish standards for that are privacy compliant, sure. But that is the only way that much of the network barriers to entry can be eliminated. The other way to think about it, to me, is that we need to go beyond the current well-meaning effort to regulate the tech giants, which are effectively antitrust in a can. I mean, as you know, there are initiatives in Brussels at the Commission to bring about regulation ex ante where antitrust has failed. If you look at the details of this regulation, they're no more than a version of antitrust rules. And I can assure you that what they will do is not very much, because these same players will say, these rules are too general, they don't apply to me, I'm not really caught, talk to me later. So we need to think about it in a more creative way, which essentially asks, if we want to establish more digital diversity, which is really the goal. I don't want to particularly break up anybody. I just want to establish the opportunity for more players out there. Instead of being staring at a world in 10, 20 years in which we have same 5 players, then what do we need to do? And I think we need to think about ideas around common digital infrastructure, shared digital infrastructure, re-establishing certain layers of the internet that have become private in the shift from Web 1 to Web 2. And now we are kind of thinking of Web 3. So we are on a cusp. I think we have seen a movement towards great aggregation, centralization, And I think there is now a need for decentralization. Doesn't mean crypto necessarily, doesn't mean blockchains, but we need to go in the direction of more decentralized systems, which are less proprietary, where the economies of scale and the network effects are not solely realized on that system, because otherwise you're going to be here in 20 years.
Terrific. So let me just translate some of that for the people who are a little less technically minded. What Cristina is saying is that there are great opportunities, but that the problem is that the nature of the pursuit makes them very uneven. And we have some remedies, including the things that you read in the newspapers in terms of how we will be able to combat this. The European Union has a Digital Market and the Digital Services Act. The United States that put one of the firebrand critics of the old way that we're doing antitrust leading the Federal Trade Commission, and the Biden administration says, we need to change that, is going to change the rules of the game. Cristina says, well, perhaps that's not enough, and perhaps we need, in addition to these tools, to consider a few more things. How do these things change? Let me give you another example to make it a bit clearer. Think about what Apple has done. Apple, if you've got Apple, has a new operating system. The new operating system called 14.5 said, hey, I'm going to protect your data. Why? Because I'm Apple. I love you. I'm a wonderful, positive firm. And all I want to do is hug people. So I will not allow any time an app is using information, I will say, hey, Mr. Customer, do you want this nasty company to have your information? Now, most people say that. It's like, oh my God, no, I don't want that. And you say no. Now, that means that there is not information that the advertisers can take and that Google or Facebook can take to sell to the advertisers to get the advertisement to you. It also means, and that's a bit hush-hush, that Apple has very, very well hidden in its own stack something that says, I'm going to have information, but I'm not going to tell you quite as loudly that I'm doing that, and it's very cheeky, but I'm going to be ruling it. Now, the advertiser is saying, oh my God, we're going to lose all of our business. So what you see here is something which says, I'm a good Boy Scout, and I'm going to have a nice little privacy app that is entirely blowing up a whole sector, which is this digital advertising, and where you see the big technology firms playing against each other. Now, I don't want to move too much about that. The only thing that I would say is that regulation, whether we mean antitrust, whether we mean privacy, or whether we mean the infrastructure that Cristina speaks about, so a broader sense of regulation, is becoming the new game changer in strategy. Why? Because it is affecting who can make money and where and how. Ownership of data, who has the right of using it and when, the access to information is a question that says, will a big tech be smaller or bigger? Will it need partners or not? So we have now a new set of issues for strategy. It's not just the tech people who will say, hey, I will come and I will combine my crazy tech idea with my understanding of the customer, and together we're going to make lots of money. It is the tech people together with the people who understand the regulation and the people who understand the customer. So now, if you want to think about the world of ecosystems, there's another new thing coming up, which is regulation. And that takes me to the last thing, and I know you have to leave, Cristina, so let me ask very quickly about the final twist, and then we'll move all the way down to some of the corporate stuff, which is geopolitics and the fact that things are changing. And the EU, the US, and China seem to be going in different directions. How does that happen first in the world of regulation? How does regulation play into that? Monica, you referred to that as well. But Cristina, tell us your answer, because I know that you have to leave after that. And then,
well, I mean, this is a tripolar world, right? There is Europe, there is the US, there is China, and how things are moving is fascinating. I mean, of course, there is a new administration in the US, which is much more interventionist. Whether it will succeed in actually bringing about regulation of the kind that we're talking here, the one that's been proposed by Ceciline, by others. At the moment, I see a great deal of hot air in Congress. People are very upset about Facebook, but no one is doing anything yet. In Europe, we have these aspirations to regulation, which I think are well-meaning. We'll see what they look like once they come out the other end from European Parliament, because a lot of effort is being expended into moving and shifting things. We have commissioners like Breton who are determined to talk about European sovereignty and all that. And so there is that dimension in all of this. And then, of course, China, it's basically doing its thing and regulation in a way that is more effective than anyone else, it would appear, but then the political regime is different. So I think the idea of a convergence between Europe and the US, I think, is not happening. I think things will remain a little in flux going forward.
Terrific. Thank you very much. We know.
Thank you very much, everyone, and apologies that I have to leave.
And thank you. And let me move now, Monica, to continuing on part of this conversation. Now, what we have heard is that we are in a world where we need to understand customer needs. We need to understand how digitization creates a new opportunity and move away from the idea of an ecosystem, which is a product and the stuff that complements it, and move towards the way that the needs evolve and the packages, the bundles that the customer can get. We also heard that regulation is going to play a role by saying, am I allowed to do that? Or is another player allowed to do that? Or who's going to be able to benefit from it? Meaning that you need to change the attitude that you have vis-a-vis the product development, vis-a-vis the way that you organize, but also get new skills by connecting with other players, by understanding the regulation, by figuring out how you're going to be creating these new packages. And these new packages are packages, these experiential multi-product packages, but also they involve to doing much more collaboration with other firms. Now, all that is wonderful, but boy, is it hard organizationally. Let me go back and delve now into the organization. What did it mean for you guys? And, you know, I know that there were a number of interesting efforts. You guys, for instance, said, oh, I'm even going to work with my, sorry to be so direct, worst enemy, Mercedes-Benz, and I'm going to offer a luxury mobility service. You said, we'll work together, and then it blew up. I don't quite know what happened with this one, but it's an area that we have seen lots of ups and downs. So give me a little bit of a sense of the challenges of a proud industrial company that has been good at making cars now needing to play in a world of ecosystems. What were the difficulties and what were the breakthroughs?
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit in terms of moving from a hardware company to a service company. I think the fact is that we are a global company, and that's what makes it so difficult. Because if you have a car, you can sell it basically anywhere. If it needs to interact with an ecosystem, and if there are services around it, I think you need to make sure that from a business perspective, these services are scalable. And we've been, for example, you're alluding to the mobility services. We've had the mobility services. We've been in this sector for some time, and we scaled this to a couple of cities in Europe. But the thing is, if you do not scale it on a larger frame, the customer will not like it, because they don't want to interact with 1,000 mobility services. They just want to have one app on their car that works everywhere. If you look at the ride-hailing sector, that's also why all these small startups have disappeared, and we are left with basically Uber in one part of the world and Grab in another part of the world, and Didi in China. So there are a lot of consolidation happening. So what you need is actually to get a piece of the market, you need to cooperate with others to have a big enough platform. And I think this ties also in with the discussion we were having about the regulation, because there is the view, especially in Europe, that you have large players in the US and you have large players in China that are able to build up large ecosystems for the consumer. And in Europe, all this landscape, the data landscape, is much more fragmented. That's why we have these initiatives that you also mentioned earlier of the European data platform. They are trying to also provide a bigger infrastructure, so to speak, a data infrastructure that we as companies can interact with and can better cooperate through. So I think having common infrastructure to cooperate with is very important for us, because if you look at the trust issue, I certainly don't want to give all our data to Mercedes-Benz, even if we are cooperating. So there needs to be some kind of intermediary, and I think this is where the regulator comes into how do we do this? How do we give everybody access to this ecosystem?
And this is interesting because what the subtext of what Monica is saying is having traditional companies learn how to dance the ecosystem dance, which is something that both BMW and Mercedes-Benz, I guess, are in the process of finding out, and then saying, you know what, we need to find new ways of both collaborating and competing, because we need to find new ways of making the customer happy. Because if we don't, someone else does. And what Monica is saying about the super apps is that you have companies that come from elsewhere, for instance, ride hailing. If you take Southeast Asia and what happened with Grab, a company that started by riding the ride hailing business and expanding in even more areas, so that competition becomes sort of more uneven. You also saw that it is an interesting managerial challenge in order to get a proud industrial company to say, I need to change my ways and I need to work on ecosystems. Now, let me end in terms of the question with, okay, that is the challenges that a mighty giant like BMW actively invested both in innovation and in mobility services and in trying to make ecosystems work, where part of its concerns is, will I be able to fend off Google and Apple, who are trying to eat part of my pie? Let's now shift to the smaller guys. Because for most of us, we are going to be partners. We're going to be participants in existing ecosystems. What would you say to those whom you would like to collaborate with? What are the new opportunities that the world of ecosystem opens up for the organizations that are out there that say, let's create magic together?
Yes, I think that there is not only danger, but there is also opportunity in terms of, once you do have an ecosystem in place with existing standards and existing interfaces, it can be much easier for companies to actually interact. And so, for example, if this European data platform succeeds at the moment, we have a lot of companies working together here. And that means everybody is providing an interface to their service, to their product, and that gives a lot of opportunity for new players to think about, how can I best connect maybe one product with another service, or maybe have an own service where I connect a couple of products, and that makes it easier to go through a common standards platform instead of having to interact as a small startup, for example, with BMW, with Mercedes. How do I get to these firms even? But if I can just interact with the platform, that makes it easier for the smaller companies to do something.
Both to do something and also to scale up, which is another important issue. So essentially what Monica is saying is that in a world of platforms and ecosystems, there are more opportunities, there are more tools for value co-creation. There is the tool for you to be able to grow and grow more significantly. So you need to think about the value that will be added to the customer, but you do not need to think that you need to do everything yourself. Whether you're a small company or you're a big company, you can participate in other people's ecosystems. As I was saying earlier on, I got my own biases, because what I've seen working with organizations that are trying to develop their own ecosystems is that there is poetry, but beyond the poetry of ecosystems, beyond the allegory and the nice images, there's also the need to do quite a bit of work. So, we've been working, for instance, in Evolution Limited and creating a framework of thinking. What are the key steps in building ecosystems? And I think that we are now in an interesting stage in terms of management thinking, of starting to articulate what are these steps in order to create these multi-product experiential ecosystems, and also these multi-actor groups, organizations that come together. What are the checkboxes that you need to do so that you can have a consistent strategy? There's a lot of fun thinking. There's a lot of strategy thinking. There's a lot of stuff that I'm sure will be the kind of material that Thinkers50 and those that contribute to it will have for a very long time. And cases that are moving quite fast, much faster than they were before, like the ones in mobility, are going to be terrific examples. So Monica, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And everyone, I hope that you got part of a sense from two female leaders in the cutting edge of thinking about ecosystems, on the one hand, on the regulatory side, on the other hand, on the corporate side. And this is part of the conversations to come. So with thanks to you, Monica, and with thanks to Stuart and Des and Thinkers50, I guess that this is it from us. And for those of you in the awards, enjoy the suspense, enjoy the awards, and enjoy the thinking that underpins it. Thanks so much again.
Thank you for inviting me.